We come across spiritual teachings everywhere these days, but we don't always know how to integrate those ideas into our personal lives. As much as we may understand the concepts of how to live an awakened and conscious life, it's not easy putting that wisdom into practice. What happens when we step out into the real world? In this series, we're going to be talking to real people about real lives. We're going to meet some amazing individuals and learn how ordinary people can overcome extraordinary battles in their lives using the wisdom of oneness. Welcome to Life Talk. Today we'll be discussing domestic abuse, what it is, what you can do about it, and how spirituality helped one woman heal herself from the trauma she received at the hands of her abusive husband. Our guest today is Sarnjit Flora. She's an international speaker and an advocate of domestic violence awareness and prevention. I've learned some of the difficulties that she's experienced, specifically with domestic violence.
Domestic violence, that's a subject we've never really spoken about.
No.
It's such an important and sensitive issue. I think we're going to learn a lot today.
Yeah, I agree.
I was living in extreme fear. No one gets married to be abused.
You can't change other people.
Am I really going through this?
Is right and wrong is wrong.
The officer asked me, did he ever rape you?
Where is that person's humanity?
Still quite painful.
Right, I'm putting my foot down. I think this just isn't working for me.
It's going to be the biggest mistake of my life.
Sarnjit first met her husband in 2005 whilst at university, and after dating for a year, they decided to get married. But soon, things started to change between them. Before the wedding day, his words became cruel and abusive. Over the next year and a half, the verbal abuse escalated to mental and physical violence. One evening, when Sarnjit returned home from work, during a conversation they were having about the laundry, he started to strangle her.
I became motionless. His grip started to tighten around my neck. I realised I was being strangled. I started gasping for what I thought were the last breaths I was ever going to breathe. I blacked out.
Looking back at your life, what were some of the emotions that you experienced during your abuse?
I was living in extreme fear. Every single day I would wonder, is what I'm saying going to cause an argument? Is how I'm going to behave going to upset him? If I go out, what if I come back home? How is he going to be? I'd lay awake at night, lying on the edge of the bed, just sad and scared. I'm really fearful as what his actions are going to be when he wakes up. How is tomorrow going to be? Am I going to go through another day like today? Is it going to be worse?
Were you ever afraid for your life?
Yeah, I was. Before we got married, his behaviour and attitude changed towards me. He was very resentful towards opinions that I would have about our wedding, the ceremonies that I wanted to happen, or the order of the procession and the proceedings. He was very, almost rebellious as to what I was saying and not taking anything on board. And for me, looking back on reflection, that's when I would say it started.
What do you think the cause of some of that was?
To be honest, there's no one pinpoint that I can give you as to where and why it started, but there's loads of contributing factors that just incrementally led up to him just changing as a person. I guess he felt extreme sense of responsibility, which in my opinion he wasn't ready for. He became resentful towards that. And when families get involved, there's so many people to please.
So the stress alone was part of it?
Stress alone was part of it. The concept of taking responsibility of getting married dawned upon him.
Right.
And realising, the house, the car, everything that you need to actually live, that had been given to him, to be fair. Now he had to work towards, just all weighed very heavily on him. And I do now believe that he can't handle stress. And when he gets into that mindset, he lashes out.
Did you ever blame yourself for the abuse?
Every day I was told it was my fault. If I hadn't spoken in a certain way, if I hadn't behaved in a certain manner, if I hadn't turned the light on, if I hadn't come back at a certain time, none of these arguments would happen. He would say, I love you. I really want to make you happy. And then he would make me believe that it was all my fault. So if you don't say this, I won't behave like this. I started to change my actions to please him, to make him feel happy. Then he would change his criteria and he would change what was acceptable and what he deemed right for him. So I was always walking on eggshells. The more that I compromised and the more I gave in, the more assertive he became, because that was massaging the ego and the power trip that he was on. This was the only way that he felt he could control me. I earned 4 times more than he did, and I know that hindered his self-confidence. And so because he couldn't use financial control over me, he would use control of taking the car keys away from me, so taking my freedom of being able to go out whenever I wanted, or even going to work.
I wonder if it's something to do with his upbringing.
Yes, most definitely. I know that it was acceptable for men to hit women in front of other family members. If you grow up seeing these things, it's just a normal behaviour for you.
And that behaviour is acceptable.
And that behaviour is acceptable, especially if it's been accepted for so many generations and it's carried on in your lineage.
You've almost been trained that that is how a man treats a woman.
Yeah.
How did it impact your life outside of marriage, at work, and your relationship with your other family?
Mm-hmm. I was sad and just really unhappy. So I didn't really want to engage with anybody when I was at work. I just wanted to do my work and kind of just deal with the issues that I'd experienced the night before or the day before in my own head. And I just became isolated and insular, very insular in the environment. But work was also a great way for me to break away from my norm that I was living at home. So it was a rescue for me. And with my family, I was hiding so much from them. So I just kind of really limited my conversations with them, because they would easily pick up if I just had elaborate conversations and discussions with them, how I was really feeling.
Were you ever able to tell your friends and family about what was going on in your personal life?
I didn't tell anybody, purely because I'd put myself in this situation and I needed to sort it, fix it, work with it as much as I could. I chose this person myself. It was what we deem as a love marriage. It was my decision. So how can I be unhappy with my decision? How could I be living this world that I had wanted and fought to live? So with the fear of losing respect and the dishonour that it would bring to my family, and just how would they feel, I just tried to struggle through, and I just didn't tell anybody. I think I confided in one of my friends and I told her we would have fights, arguments, but not at any point did I ever tell anybody about the physical abuse. And there would be instances where I would go home and I would have a slight bruise on my face and I would cover it with makeup, and my mum would ask me what's happened, and I would just say, oh, I just banged into something, you know how clumsy I am, so I'd cover it up. And there'd be other times where I'd wake up with a red eye because he'd punched me the day before. And again, my mum and my work colleagues were like, what happened to your eye? What's wrong? And I just said, oh, I woke up with this. I don't know why. It's an infection. The doctor said I just need to have some eye drops and it would clear. So I'd always cover up because I was ashamed. I was hugely ashamed of what was going on. And I was just a fake persona at home, a different persona at work, a different persona with my family. And with that, I didn't know who I was.
What was the turning point that made you decide that you had to get out of this situation?
My parents coincidentally found out that I was being abused by a voicemail that my ex-husband left on my dad's mobile. And it was of me screaming, because at that point he had pushed me to the floor. My face was head down in the carpet and he was yanking my hair and I was screaming, telling him to get off me. And having twisted my arm round me, he was looking at the phone. I don't know how long it was, maybe 5-10 minutes later, I just hear footsteps running to the door, and my mum's banging on the door. She's like, "Where the f*** is he? He's hitting my daughter. What is he doing?" I open the door, and I struggle to get up, open the door, and I just collapse back on the sofa, and I'm just violently crying at this point. My dad just walks into the house, and he's walking around the house trying to find him. My mum's in this mad frenzy of, "How dare you touch my daughter? How dare you put her in this pain?" And she was screaming, and she was still swearing. And she just ran over to me, and she held me, and I just remember sobbing in her arms. And I remember my dad sitting on the steps, and it's still quite painful, because just knowing that my parents went through so much. Sorry.
No.
So weird, I didn't expect this to come out of me. So we called the police, and they immediately came over, and there was 2 police officers in the house. And this was the first time the police had been involved, and this was the first time my parents were exposed to what I'd been living for that year and a half. They really got a clear picture as to what my life was in this marriage. And then the officer asked me, "Did he ever rape you?" And I just remember my mum just gasping for air, and my dad literally, his head just fell in his hands. And thankfully, no, he didn't do that. That day when the police came, my parents took my clothes, a few of my clothes, and lifted me out of that situation.
What an ordeal for parents to go through.
It really was. I mean, I was going through the incidents, and my mum was like, "That was the day that you came home and you had that bruise on your face, and that was the day I asked you what happened to your eye, and that was the day that you weren't feeling really well." And she was piecing the story together.
When your dad came there that day, did he see your then husband?
No, Mum and Dad didn't see him. He'd fled the house, and he was nowhere to be seen after that, actually, until he started to stalk me afterwards, after work and outside the house, outside my parents' house. But for quite a while, no one saw him.
How long did you tolerate the abuse?
I stayed in that marriage for a year and a half, and it was abusive for that whole duration, that whole year and a half that I was in the marriage. It started from day one, from our Lama. I just remember, actually, thinking back now, I had Mendi put on my hands 2 days before our wedding, and I remember sitting there crying into my hands, knowing that this was going to be the biggest mistake of my life, and just knowing that I was making the wrong decision. But because of the commitment that I'd made and the decision that I'd made to choose this person, the financial commitment that my parents had put into the wedding, all my family was sitting downstairs celebrating, and I'm upstairs arguing on the phone with him, with my Mendi on my hands, petrified, knowing what I was entering into. But it had gone too far by then, in my opinion, for me to pull out, and it's hard. It's really hard to pull out at that stage. You just almost feel the responsibility of just going through it, just because now you're there. And that pinnacle point is the point where you realise that you're either the happiest person or you're making the worst mistake. And I say to people now when I'm speaking, if there's any microscopic bit in you that is telling you that this is wrong, if there's any voice inside you that is voicing the opposite to what you're portraying to the world and the facade that you have, you need to voice it to somebody. You need to have a conversation with somebody and let somebody who's looking upon the situation give you guidance and just help you clear your mind and thought processes, because it's all just a frazzle when you're in that wedding process.
I suppose the big question on everyone's mind is, why didn't you get out sooner?
Yeah, I asked myself that. It was difficult. It was really difficult for me to walk away from a situation again because I decided to marry, and I tried every day to make it work. He would tell me, if you don't do this, everything will get better. And those words were my mantra. If I don't do this, he'll still love me and we can carry on with the life and dreams that we had once talked about. I didn't want to be that person that was tainted with divorce. And I didn't want to be scarred as that woman who's been physically abused. And I could feel those opinions already of everybody else just kind of casting this veil of disgust over me. And the fear of that, the fear of what society would say, and the fear of dishonouring my family, and how would they feel? How would they respond to everybody else? And, you know, we're brought up, I feel, in a way to conform to people's expectations of how you should behave. So there's so many reasons as to the barriers of why I didn't leave this relationship. And I wanted to be married. I wanted to have that happy life that I'd once dreamed of. And no one gets married to get divorced. And no one gets married to be abused. And it's not something that you sign up for. And so I was fighting with all of those, and I was fighting with myself as to what can I do to make it better. I just want it to be a normal life, and I just want to be happy.
Did you ever have a lack of clarity that you were in fact a victim of abuse?
I didn't know that I was a victim. I didn't know I was becoming a victim. I knew what was happening wasn't right. I knew what was happening wasn't normal in my family, and it's not something I'd ever been exposed to, but I didn't deem myself as a victim. In fact, I saw myself as that strong woman trying to make it work.
What was life finally like when you did actually leave that situation?
It was very lonely. I lost sight of who I was. I lost all self-confidence. It was a dark, sad, lonely place where I'd contemplated suicide many times, so many times, because I just couldn't bear to be living this unidentifiable life. I didn't know what normal was anymore. I hid in the house for 2 years. I would only go to work and come home because I was afraid of shame. I didn't want anyone's pity at all. So life was really tough. It was really, really tough. And I went through quite a few years of depression, of seeing counsellors, of being put on and taken off suicide watch. I went into anorexia, stopped eating. So I looked physically ill. I was soul destroyed, emotionally, mentally, physically. I was completely shattered. My whole world had been shattered.
It's often that you think about domestic abuse as being physical violence, but you say that the violence happened a lot later. Mm-hmm. But what are some of the other forms of abuse that you experienced?
I experienced the verbal and mental abuse very early on, and then it quickly escalated to physical abuse. And these sort of types of abuses are sometimes hard to identify, whether it be through the words, through the physical behaviour, through financial control, through manipulation of your thought processes. So it's not actually something that you can physically pinpoint as a bruise. It's something that's done at a psychological level.
So can we say that even things like abusive language, threatening words, that is classed as a form of violence?
Yep, absolutely. All of it. All of that is classed as a form of violence. And even controlling someone's way of what they wear and how they tie their hair up and if they wear makeup, all these subtle things can, if consistently done, can be conceived as a form of violence.
So I guess it's just any form of restricting the freedom of another person and exerting your own control over them.
And also it comes down to the frequency and the extent of the behaviour. In a relationship, you're bound to have ideas of how you think things should be done, and the other person may disagree, but it's allowing someone the respect and the freedom to do things their way, and sometimes having your say but not enforcing that on someone else.
Because I suppose that's a scenario that comes up in any marriage where you're going to come across a difference of opinion or a different way of doing things, but the respect that you have for each other means that there's always a level of compromise. I suppose the point at which you have no more compromise left within you, that you always want to exert your control, that's where some of these abusive behaviors start coming out, even if it's just being manipulative and making sure that the other person always gives in, or saying things or forcing them to do what you want them to do.
Yeah. Perpetrators use this as a form of gaining power and empowerment over their partner, to massage their ego or to make them feel superior. And the only way they can do that is making someone feel inferior and somebody bowing down to them, to belittle someone, to control them, to dictate.
Is it ever okay to make someone do something against their own will?
In my opinion, no. I don't see how anybody has the right to dictate and enforce their power over somebody.
I wonder in a family situation how many times that occurs where, for example, if there are a couple who are having an argument, one of you might turn around and say, right, I'm putting my foot down. Is that a form of abuse? Because the other person then is forced to compromise. Abuse for me is the point at which it just becomes too one-sided. It's always leaning towards one person. It's always one person giving in. There's too much control from one side of the relationship.
I would ask a series of questions. I mean, how often is this happening for me? Where is there a positive outcome for me as well as the other person? Am I comfortable with this? Is this going to serve our relationship? And if it's going to serve our relationship, is it going to be a positive impact on me, or is it going to be detrimental to my mental health or to my emotional or my level of free will? I'd ask myself a series of questions, and from that, just making a judgment from those sincere answers, you'll be able to identify how and what your tolerance levels are.
I suppose that word tolerance is really key. It's the point at which you feel like it's something that's impacting your life.
Yeah. And just, how do I feel about it? Do I feel happy about this? I mean, we're not always right. Our partners can be right, as much as we want to admit it or not. But, it's just that process of, okay, you're right in this instance. I need to just back down because it's my ego at play here.
Even with children, we do have to encourage them and in some instances force them to do things that they don't want to. They don't want to do their homework. They don't want to go to school. So answering the question of, do you have to do things sometimes for people against their will? Again, whether you can say a blanket yes or no to that, it depends on the individual situation.
There's a really interesting quote by Oprah. She says, anytime you are restricted from being who you want to be and you are suppressing yourself to act in a way that other people want you to act, that's abuse. I take that as a great general sort of guide for people to start reflecting upon themselves. But going back to your point about children, you're right, we often do make children do things that they don't want to do. But again, maybe we have to empower children to ask themselves their own questions about how they feel and allow space for communication so they can actually try and reflect on, how is this in the long term impacting me?
It's interesting because even in a loving, healthy relationship, there will be preferences of what you like the other person to do. So, for example, I know my mother-in-law is very happy to see me wearing Indian suits, and she loves to see me wearing beautiful Indian suits. And I will happily wear them for her on certain occasions because I know it will please her. But I'm not somebody who generally tends to wear Indian suits very much. If I can avoid it, I will, because it's more of a faff with the chunni and everything. So it's an example of where you're doing something not because it's me and is defining me as a person, but it's to please somebody else. And in any loving, healthy relationship, there is an element of that.
That's compromise, isn't it?
It's compromise.
You have to give and take. I mean, wearing an Indian suit, how much is that really going to affect you in the long run? To give somebody else a form of happiness is a form of seva. And, you know, just to do small bits like that's not, in my opinion, something that should really impact you so much.
I suppose the individual will have to decide, because there may be another person for whom that same scenario is completely damaging. And it isn't for us to then judge another person and say, well, just get on with it. They have to really be allowed to express their own emotions and say, this just isn't working for me, and I need to be able to have a clear avenue to discuss this, or to express myself in a certain way.
We're always shown from a younger age and being dictated to that this is how things should be. We're told at school you need to concentrate, but we're not taught how to concentrate. And, you know, you need to do this, but we're not necessarily given the reasons as to why we have to do certain things, like eat vegetables, for example, simple things like that. And I think just putting the context around those things for the children, and then, as you said, allowing them to be mindful, taking a step back to compute, actually, there is some sense to why I'm being told to do these things.
I guess when you're coming to the conclusion yourself that the behavior of somebody else is constantly putting you down, is making you feel fearful, is making you feel bad, is making you feel unhealthy and unwell, then that's where it's becoming more than just a compromise in a relationship. It's becoming a form of abuse. What is it that's helped you in healing yourself and moving forward?
I think after experiencing those years of turmoil and pain and legal battles, I sat back and I just still felt empty once it finished. And I realised that there's something inside me that wasn't fulfilled, and I still felt really sad, and I still felt lonely, really lonely. And I found a yoga of the mind called Raja Yoga. It's conducted by Brahma Kumaris, and this principle teaches you about the soul that resides within you, and then I realised that the darkness that I had experienced, there is a form of light in there, and for me, I realised that the light for me at that point, going through the horrendous time, was my strength. And no matter how many times he beat me down, no matter how many times he hit my head against the wall or punched me or whatever it was that he did, I would always get back up. I'd always bounce back, and I'd just keep going. I'd keep going, and because it made me feel like I wasn't alone anymore, that I'd found something that I could connect with. And from there I evolved to yoga, to Kundalini yoga, and it uses Gurbani mantras to help you connect within. And then when I'd encountered the divine connectedness through Simran, that was so powerful at that point. Just even 5-10 minutes, it just made such a difference for me. It kind of centered me and aligned me when I was feeling wobbly. It was like a breath of fresh air. It was something that I had not experienced before ever. A friend of mine suggested that I look at some of Nanak Naam's videos, and that Satpal Paji was really inspiring. So I came to one of the Japji Sahib classes actually, and from the first class I was hooked.
When you came.
Yeah, I was hooked, and I was like, it all makes sense now. And it's just, you realise that with all these elements, there's one message. They're all saying the same thing, just in different ways.
They're all pointing in the same direction, and that's inwards.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it might be a good opportunity to look at what Gurbani has to say about cruelty and abuse within the family. There's a Shabad by Guru Nanak Dev Ji, which is specifically addressing the evil characteristics that we carry within ourselves. And so in this Shabad, Guru Nanak says, evil-mindedness, the Guru describes these evil characteristics as demons that are sitting inside you. He talks about evil-mindedness as being a reject of society. He talks about cruelty being like a butcher, the gossip and slander and evil words against another person as being a filthy road sweeper, and rage as being a social outcast. And he says, what use are the ceremonial traditions and the ceremonial lines that you are drawing? So in those days, there were people who used to draw a protective line around their kitchen to protect their food from evil. And Guruji says, what use are these ceremonial traditions and these lines that you're drawing when those demons are sitting inside you? And the Guru says that the solution to this is to make truthful living your discipline, make good actions the protective lines that you draw, and make the awareness of chanting to be your cleansing spiritual bathing. And Nanak says that those people are exalted who don't walk on the path of sin. So I thought that's really interesting that Guruji really spells out the characteristics of what it means to be spiritual. There's even a word here which only appears in this Shabad, which is the opposite of compassion, kudaya, the opposite of daya. And it's the only time when the Guru has used this word. And he's talking about how all of the demons and the evil spirits that people are afraid of, he said, no, you've got them right inside you. Yeah. Your evil-mindedness, your lack of compassion, your rage, that is the demon that you have to be afraid of. That's the demon that you have to protect yourself from. And there's a solution, which is that you actually change your entire perspective. Change your perspective from doing external actions into actually fixing those demons with truth, with Naam Simran, with meditation. Make those your spiritual practices.
It's using Naam and the wisdom of Gurbani to actually put light on your behavior and actually shape the way that you think.
I live with my husband's family and I'm constantly made to feel like a slave by his parents, to work to please him and them whilst he rests from the stresses of a hard day's work. I look after the house and children, but nothing is ever good enough for his parents. I am told that it is my duty to treat my husband as a god, a Pati Parmeshwar. They are very religious, they pray constantly, but still play politics in the family to create a rift between me and my husband, whilst he continues to ignore the faults of his parents. Is this right? I can't tell you the number of times that I've received a question of this nature where young women are being verbally and mentally abused by their mother-in-laws and also completely ignored by their husbands. And we talked about some of the problems within Indian culture and society. I would say this is probably at the very top of that list of problems. And a lot of the times people feel completely stuck. They don't know what it is that they can do. And my response to that is at some point you have to be able to make a conscious decision. Where do I draw the line? At what point is it enough for me? The reason why people stay in these situations for too long is I think that they are constantly carrying around a false sense of hope that the other person will change. If I do this, the other person will change. If I keep making compromises, the other person is eventually going to see that I'm making that effort. And what I always try and get people to reflect on is at what point will you realize that perhaps the other person isn't going to change? And be comfortable now with the fact that you can't change other people. Yeah. You can try to change yourself, but don't keep holding on to the hope that the other person is going to change.
Especially if they're not looking to change or willing to change.
If they're not willing to change, then there's nothing you're going to do that's going to make them now realize that you're not worthy of that abuse.
And we can only change ourselves. We can't change anybody.
And if you've compromised enough, at some point you're going to have to ask yourself this very important question: can I live with who they are right now?
And can I keep doing this?
Can I keep doing this? At some point, if you realize that the other person isn't going to change, how does that make me feel? Can I stay within that situation? And if you decide that enough is enough, there is no reason for you to carry on staying within that situation, because it doesn't matter what other people think. It isn't about whether your life is going to be harder or whether there's other people whose opinions you're going to have to face. You have to ask yourself this question: can I live with this right now? And then at some point it's a simple yes or no.
You're the only one that can make the situation better for yourself. And you're the only one that can lift yourself out by making that decision.
Of course, it becomes so much more complicated when there are children involved. But even your children living in a family where abuse is prevalent, that's abuse to the children.
Yeah. And what we're doing actually is creating more possible perpetrators, because all they can see is abuse or unsettlement, an unhealthy environment.
It normalizes it.
It normalizes it.
It isn't for anyone else to tell you that you should definitely get up and leave the relationship. You know, leaving might be the very last thing that you do. Maybe you do try and approach an independent third party who can intervene and talk to both sides. Maybe you do try counseling, or you try any other methods of communication. But it has to be action that delivers some progress.
Yeah.
And if there's no progress, no matter how much effort you've put in, at some point you're just going to have to decide.
You have to decide. Yeah, I mean, we're in a generation now where we don't have to keep living what our grandparents lived, or even our parents. We don't have to stay stuck in that situation, because now we have more choices. There are more options. There are safe homes. There are support charities. There's the people's mindsets have evolved. You don't need to just be burdened in this situation because you feel there's nothing out there.
And I guess that was one of the main reasons growing up. Our parents wanted us to get educated. They wanted us to be independent so that you're not trapped. But I wonder if through that whole process, our tolerance level has significantly reduced compared to our parents' generation. I mean, we hear how mother-in-laws are demonized in a lot of ways as well. So is there another aspect to this where women, because they're so empowered and so independent and they're so able to financially support themselves as well, are willing to tolerate so little that relationships are hard to keep together now?
It's like we've been enabled with the knowledge and the tools, the security, but it doesn't always work in our favour. It's not something that you should take lightly, just to walk away.
And I think for a man, actually, who is in a situation where there may be some level of abuse going on, whether it's the mother-in-law, it's a very difficult position for a man to be in, because it's difficult to keep everybody happy.
I wonder if it is a difficult position for the man, because yes, you've got 2 or 3 strong characters in the family that you're trying to keep the peace with, but ultimately, as a man, you need to be able to put your foot down and decide when someone is being fair or unfair.
Regardless of what their authority is or what your relationship with them is. Right is right and wrong is wrong.
Wrong is wrong. And you have to be able to stand up when your mother is saying something wrong, or when your wife is not compromising enough. You need to be able to make that difficult decision.
The main reason for them having that resentment against their daughter-in-law is because they want their son to be close to them. The best way to keep your son close to you is to actually treat your daughter-in-law well, and your son will automatically be close to you. If it was actually brought into the light of conscious awareness, you wouldn't behave like that. You would actually want to be loving and caring and respectful.
Yeah, I mean, because at the end of the day, you know, they were a daughter of somebody else's, and they may have daughters too. So you would want to treat the new daughter come into the family as you would want to be treated, or how you'd want your daughter to be treated.
And I can imagine very, very few families probably sit down and have a conversation about their experiences, about what is or isn't working. And it's not an easy thing to do. It's not comfortable to do. But how many family relationships would change if that was actually implemented?
For me, any abuse is coming from a personal discomfort.
Yeah.
You aren't easy in your own self. You aren't in a good place within your own self. And maybe the mother-in-law has lived decades of suppression in their own lives, and their only love that they can cling to is their son, and now the only thing that gives them joy is being taken away from them. So they are suffering themselves. The person doing the abuse is also in internal turmoil. There are so many times where you think you might come from a religious family, or you're doing things that you think are of a spiritual nature, but spirituality means nothing if you haven't actually fixed who you are inside. If you're not compassionate, if you're not kind with your words, if you're not considerate of other people's feelings, then all of your spirituality is really a waste of time. And the Guru specifically says, well, what do you think you're doing?
But if you sift through all of the angered voice and the confrontation or the physical abuse, whatever it is, if you sift through all of that and you go down to the core is that everyone is searching for love, and the perpetrator is searching for the same thing. You just cry out and you call out for it in a different way.
In their own screwed up way, really.
In their own screwed up way. Yeah.
What are the early signs to spot if someone has an abusive nature?
So change in personality, change in the way that person speaks to you, or something that was normal kind of isn't there anymore. Like, oh, he used to tell me I look really nice, or, he used to say he'd love me so-and-so times, or as a sign-off on the phone, but he doesn't do that anymore. And if something suddenly changes, that's a clear sign that there's something not right there. It's better to notice these in an ideal world at the beginning, so you can kind of capture them and understand and realise that, can I live with this or can I not? And will I be okay with this in 5 to 10 years' time, or will I not be? Can I see escalating getting worse, or can I see me being able to manage it?
The early signs really point down to humanity. Where is that person's humanity? If they are constantly able to treat you respectfully, compassionately, kindly, and they're showing you a sense of decency and love, then you know that that's a person who maybe once in a while may lose their temper at you, but that isn't a consistent part of their behavior. And if that person is no longer able to treat you in a humane way, and that becomes part of their consistent behavior, then I think those are some really early warning signs.
Absolutely.
How long has it been since your abuse, and does it still affect you today?
It's been 11 years since I left that environment. I'm a completely different person now to who I was. I now say that what I experienced and lived, I'd see as a blessing now, because I wouldn't be the person that I am today if I hadn't been broken down and lived that world of hell for that amount of time. It doesn't define me, it's a part of me, but it's not part of who I am now. That even though you think you've dealt with everything and you continue to work through blockages and you continue to work through emotions that may arise now and again, I feel it's always going to be there at some level. It's an ongoing process. So would I ever be able to sit back and say, I've done it? I've actually got rid of all my scars and I've got rid of everything and I've walked away from my experience completely. Not sure. I'm still waiting to get there. If I can, if I do. As they say, time is a great healer, and it really is. I can look back now and know that I lived it, and it's okay that I lived it, because it's just a part of my life that I had to experience, and it's a part of my karma.
What would you say to someone who is watching or listening today and recognizes some of the behaviors that we've talked about?
I say this to people who are suffering, are experiencing what we've spoken about today, is to most definitely voice it and not to be ashamed of it. There's no shame of you experiencing what you're experiencing. It's an unfortunate situation, but it's not your fault. And to know it's not your fault, be strong enough to voice it to somebody, to have that conversation, because you won't feel alone in that situation then. Whether that be from a colleague at work, for example, or whether that be you going to speak to a counsellor from your GP, or seeking independent advice through the support lines such as, Women's Aid, Sikh Helpline, Victim Support. Just pick up the phone and have a conversation. It doesn't need to be more than that.
See, someone in that situation might feel, what can these people do?
Yeah.
Victim support, what can these people actually do? They're not going to come in my home and help me. What can they do?
So they can give you guidance, they can give you perspective. And when you're in this situation, you don't have perspective. And it's not comfortable to do. It's not easy. And I'm not saying it is, but just taking that step. And you never know what advice you could be given.
I can imagine if you suspect that somebody might be in that situation, even to take a step to actually approach them to talk about it, you might be opening up a Pandora's box. You don't know what they... Yeah. So even to take that step can be quite a decision, actually, because you don't know what they're actually dealing with.
Very challenging, and typically you don't want to get involved. You don't want to be seen as a person to break up a relationship, and you just don't want that responsibility.
As a bystander, I can imagine thinking that, well, I don't really know how to solve the situation. I don't know what to tell you or what advice to give you. So maybe should I bring the conversation up at all? Because I don't know if I'm going to be able to offer you any help.
Sometimes people just need someone to listen, to hear them. And when you're talking, you're hearing your own words and you're realising, oh my God, am I really living this? Is this really what's coming out of my mouth? Am I really going through this? You can just even get that moment of perspective.
I think it's really easy for a lot of people watching or listening today to assume that domestic abuse has nothing to do with them. But I would say that everyone watching should take a moment to reflect on how their own behavior is impacting the people around them. Because one thing that I've learned from today is that domestic abuse can occur in so many different ways. So everyone should reflect on the people who they engage with on a regular basis and think about, what are the things that I'm saying, or what are the things that I'm not doing? Because I can imagine that maybe just ignoring someone can be a type of abuse, or being overly harsh to your children can be a type of abuse. So I think every single person who has listened and watched what you've had to say today has got something that they can go home and think about their own life.
Tell us about your life now and how you use your experience to help other people now.
So my life now is very different. I'm an international speaker and advocate on domestic violence and abuse, awareness and prevention. I've toured around Sydney, speaking for a big charity out there called White Ribbon, who specifically work with men to prevent men's abuse towards women. So it's a very different angle that they've taken, and it's an amazing charity. They're also present over here in the UK. My phase of my life is raising awareness through public speaking, through one-to-one sessions with women where I work with them using my healing techniques that I've used and give them the tools to enable them. And that's really where I see my seva and purpose work in the world. It's staggering that 1 in 3 women suffer abuse in their lifetime from a former or current partner. And that's equivalent to 1.16 billion women worldwide. Wow. And that's 50% in the UK itself. It's 50% of women in the UK suffer abuse.
How can people get in touch with you?
So I have a Facebook page, which is Sarnjit Flora. My website, sarnjitflora.com. My Instagram is Sarnjit Flora, and my Twitter handle's Sarnjit Flora too. So just use my name and you'll be able to find me. And I'll just try and help in whichever way that I can.
I think for me, I've probably taken away today how small steps can lead to such a big picture of abuse and victimization. So I'm certainly going to be using this as an opportunity just to reflect on the little steps that I'm taking that I may think are being insignificant, but really at some point they can have a long-lasting damaging effect. And the other thing that I've learned from today's show is how many years the abuse continues well after the person or the relationship has broken apart. You're still suffering, and people can carry on living that trauma if they don't have some spirituality or some guidance to help them, to help lift them,
help heal them from
help
that.
heal them.
I think it's inevitable that an experience like that will undoubtedly mold and shape your life. It has to. The key is that although it will affect your life, it should not define your life, exactly as you said, and your life has to flourish and become whatever it can be, regardless of that experience.
You can't give up on life. It's a gift. Every breath is a gift. And I know that because my breath was taken away from me and I was given it back. And I'm a voice for those 447 women that died that year I was strangled as a result of a partner homicide. I could have been that 448th woman, but I'm not, and I am still here.
I think it's been a really fascinating conversation, and it's been really good to actually have this discussion and bring these things out into the light and to talk about them like this.
I think we don't appreciate how many people it affects in the UK and all over the world, and whether it's women being abused by men or men being abused by women, or same-sex relationships, or parents and children. And so we really need to go away and reflect on how our own behaviours are affecting people, and I really want to thank you for coming in and educating us on this subject. It's been great having you.
Thank you for having me.